Let me tell you about expectation. It's not the same as hope. Hope is airy, it looks up. Expectation is heavy. It settles in your bones. It's the quiet assumption that tomorrow will be a slightly worn copy of today. For 22 years of marriage to David, and for 15 years of deep, sisterly friendship with Eleanor, my expectations were the foundation of my entire world. They were not grand. They were simple, sturdy things. That David would kiss me on the forehead before leaving for work. That the faint smell of his sandalwood cologne would linger in the hall. That Eleanor and I would have our Tuesday wine and debrief, where our conversations were a seamless tapestry of finished sentences and understood silences. I expected the comfortable, worn path of our shared history to continue, winding predictably towards a gentle, distant horizon. I expected nothing to change. And because I expected nothing, I was asleep. I was sleepwalking through my own life, mistaking routine for meaning, mistaking comfort for love. The day it happened was a Tuesday, of course. A day already belonging to Eleanor in my mind. I had a late afternoon client consultation across town, but it was canceled at the last minute. A sick child, a reschedule. I felt a minor ripple of annoyance, then a flicker of unplanned freedom. I decided to stop by the little French pâtisserie David loved, to pick up those almond croissants he was always mentioning. A small surprise. A tiny, wifely deviation from the expected script. The late April sun was that particular kind of golden that makes even your own neighborhood look like a film set. I turned onto our street, our quiet, tree-lined street with its identical porch swings and curated flower beds. And I saw his car. The familiar gray sedan was in the driveway, at 3:17 on a Tuesday afternoon. David, who was a creature of such meticulous habit that his digital calendar sent alerts for things like dentist, 6-month follow-up, was home. A flicker of concern. Was he ill? But it was quickly overshadowed by a silly, girlish pleasure. We could have an unexpected, quiet hour together. Maybe I'd make tea. Then my eye caught it. A block down, tucked just past the Johnsons' large maple, was a little blue hatchback. Eleanor's car. The one I'd driven 100 times. The one with the faint stain of my spilled coffee on the passenger seat from a road trip 2 summers prior. A coincidence, my brain offered, a weak, sputtering offering. She sometimes walked this neighborhood. She liked the gardens. Maybe she'd stopped by to drop something off for me. But why park around the corner? Why not in the driveway? The two facts, David's car at home, Eleanor's car hidden, clicked together in my mind with a sound like a deadbolt sliding home. My body understood before my mind did. A coldness started in my fingertips, a hollowing out in my stomach. I drove past our house, parked 2 streets over. My hands were steady as I turned the key. I remember that. A terrifying, surgical steadiness. I walked back. I didn't run. I walked like someone approaching the edge of a cliff, each step deliberate, measured. I didn't go to the front door. I went around the side, through the gate that squeaked. David had been meaning to oil it for months. Our backyard was empty. The kitchen patio doors, the ones we'd installed for more light, were partially open, the sheer curtains drifting in the mild breeze. And I saw them. They were in the kitchen. My kitchen. David was leaning against the granite countertop I'd chosen, the one he'd thought was too expensive. He was wearing the soft, gray Henley shirt I'd bought him for his birthday. He was smiling, a smile that transformed his whole face, a smile of ease, of unguarded delight that I realized, with a lurch, I hadn't been the cause of in years. Eleanor was perched on a stool at the island, her legs crossed. She was holding a glass of water, and she was laughing. Not her polite, cocktail party laugh. Her Real laugh, the one that crinkled her eyes and made her snort a little. The one I thought she reserved for me. They weren't kissing. They weren't entangled in some dramatic, passionate clutch that, perhaps, I could have processed as a monstrous, explosive mistake. This was worse. This was domestic. This was intimate. This was a scene from a marriage, but it was theirs, not mine. He reached over and plucked a piece of lint from the sleeve of her cardigan. A gesture of such casual, tender familiarity it stole the breath from my lungs. He said something I couldn't hear. She shook her head, still smiling, and reached out to swat his arm. It was a dance. A quiet, private dance they'd clearly been performing for a long time. The ease between them was a living thing in the room, thick and palpable. Even from where I stood, frozen, in the shadow of the hydrangea bush. I watched. I don't know for how long. 30 seconds? 5 minutes? Time lost all meaning. I was a ghost in my own garden, witnessing the haunting of my own life. I saw the way his gaze rested on her, not with the distracted, kindly affection he showed me, but with a focused, present intensity. I saw the way she looked at him, not as my friend looking at my husband, but as a woman looking at her man. It was all there. In the tilt of a head, the space between their bodies that hummed with connection, the shared joke that hung in the air. This was not a first fumbled confession. This was a well-established country, with its own borders, its own language, its own history. And I was the outsider. The colonial power on a forgotten map. The croissant bag was still in my hand. I looked down at it, this stupid, paper symbol of my wifely expectation. I let it drop onto the damp grass. I turned and walked away. I didn't confront them. I didn't scream. I walked back to my car, got in and drove. I drove without destination. The steady hum of the engine the only thing anchoring me to reality. My mind was not a storm of tears or rage. It was a cold, clear, and horrifyingly efficient machine. It began replaying our history on a new reel. The business trips that had become more frequent. David's new, passionate interest in hiking, an interest Eleanor had always had. The weekend I'd spent caring for my sick mother, and how grateful David had been that Eleanor checked in on him, bringing over a casserole. The way Eleanor had gently asked 6 months ago if David and I were really okay. Her eyes filled with what I'd mistaken for empathetic concern, but now understood as reconnaissance. The inside jokes they'd sometimes share that would leave me smiling but slightly bewildered. You had to be there, David would say, ruffling my hair. And I was never there. I was the before and thereafter. I was the audience to their private play. I drove until the city gave way to fields. I pulled over on a country lane, the silence absolute. And then and only then did I scream. It was a raw, animal sound that tore from a place so deep inside me I didn't know it existed. It was the sound of the Catherine I had been. The trusting wife, the loyal friend, the woman who expected nothing, dying. When it was over, there was just a hollow, ringing quiet. I was empty, scoured clean. I didn't go home that night. I booked a room in a generic airport hotel under my maiden name. A name that felt like a skin I'd shed a lifetime ago. I sat on the stiff bedspread in the sterile room, and I made a list. Not an emotional list. A tactical one. Assets. Liabilities. Bank accounts. The name of our lawyer. The password to the shared cloud drive where we kept our tax documents. I was no longer a wife discovering a betrayal. I was a general surveying the battlefield after a surprise attack. The heartbreak was a luxury I could not yet afford. It sat in a locked room in my chest. I would visit it later. Now I had to think. The greatest shock, in those first 48 hours, was not the infidelity itself. It was the annihilation of my own perception. If I could be so utterly wrong about this, the two central pillars of my adult life, what could I be right about? My judgment was worthless. My intuition was a liar. The narrative of my life was a fiction they had co-authored. And I had been a gullible reader, missing all the subtext. This epistemological crisis was more devastating than the betrayal. Who was I, if not the woman who was married to David, friends with Eleanor? I had no answer. I returned home the following evening. I walked in the front door like a stranger. David was in the living room, watching the news. The scene was so normal it was surreal. "Hey you," he said, looking up with a mild smile. "You were late last night. Everything okay with that client?" The lie was so effortless. It was the lie of a man who had been lying for a long, long time. It wasn't nervous or shifty. It was practiced. Polished. It was part of the expected script. I looked at him. I really looked. I saw the slight thinning of his hair at the crown. The new lines around his eyes that I'd thought were from work stress. I saw a man I had shared a bed, a home, and a life with for over 2 decades. And I realized I did not know him at all. The David I knew was a carefully constructed character, and Eleanor was his audience of one. I was just stage dressing. "The client was fine," I said, my voice sounding remarkably normal. "I just needed some time to myself after." That, at least, was the truth. I moved through the house like a forensic investigator. Every room held new evidence. The book on his nightstand, a novel about the Appalachian Trail. Eleanor had hiked there last summer. The bottle of the specific brand of hot sauce in the fridge that Eleanor loved, that David claimed to have developed a taste for. The casual mention in a text thread with Eleanor from months ago. "Dee says the rosemary bush is thriving." She'd given us that bush. Ide furguten. He hadn't. I began to gather information with a detached, clinical precision. I accessed our phone bill online. There were no suspicious late-night calls to her number. Of course there weren't. They used an encrypted messaging app. I'd seen it on his phone once, Signal. He'd said it was for a secure work project. I hired a discreet, and exorbitantly expensive, private investigator. Not because I needed proof for a court, but because I needed proof for myself. I needed to see the shape and size of the country they had built. The PI was a woman my age, named Miriam. She had a kind, tired face and asked no moral questions. Within a week, she provided a dossier. Photographs of them entering a boutique hotel in the next city over on a Wednesday afternoon. Receipts from a romantic, obscure restaurant I'd never heard of. Dated on the night of my book club. A record of a weekend rental cabin, paid for with a credit card David had told me was for office supplies. The evidence was not a knife to the heart. It was an anatomy textbook. It laid bare the structure of the deception. It was vast. It was meticulous. It was a second life. Confrontation is what you see in movies. Tears thrown china screaming in the rain. My confrontation was different. I waited until we had a mundane, quiet Sunday morning. He was reading the paper. I was making coffee. The sun was shining. I leaned against the same counter he'd leaned against that first day I saw them. "David," I said. My voice was quiet. "I know about you and Eleanor." He didn't startle. He didn't drop his paper. He slowly lowered it, folded it with deliberate care, and placed it on the table. He looked at me. And in his eyes, I didn't see panic or guilt. I saw a profound, weary resignation. And something else, relief. The relief of a man who no longer has to keep 2 calendars. That was the moment I knew, irrevocably, that it was over. Not because of the affair, but because of that relief. He had been waiting for this. Waiting for me to catch up to the reality he'd been living in. "How long?" I asked. The question felt absurd, but necessary. He sighed a long, slow exhalation. 3 years. 3 years. 1,095 days. A child conceived and born into this parallel world. My mind reeled. 3 years of Tuesday wines with Eleanor, where she'd listen to me talk about my marital frustrations, my fears about David's distance. 3 years of her offering soothing, treasonous advice. 3 years of me being the unwitting clown in their tragicomedy. "Do you love her?" Another absurd, necessary question. He was silent for a long time. He looked out the window. "She understands me. In a way that..." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence that so clearly ended with "you don't." I nodded. "You need to leave." Today. You can go to her. I'm sure she'll understand. The ice in my voice surprised even me. He did leave. He packed a suitcase with a chilling efficiency that spoke of having mentally rehearsed this moment. He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He said, "I'm sorry, Catherine. I never wanted to hurt you." The most banal, useless lie of all. The door clicked shut behind him. The silence in the house was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum, of space. It was the silence after the explosion, when all the sound has been sucked away. Then I called Eleanor. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright. "Cut. I was just thinking about you. Tuesday still on?" "He's on his way to you," I said, my voice flat metallic. "You can have him. You've had him for 3 years anyway. I just wanted you to know that I know. And that you are dead to me. Do not call. Do not text. Do not try to explain. There is no word in any language for what you are to me now." I hung up. I blocked her number, her email, her social media. I performed a digital excision. I was not interested in her reasons, her apologies, her twisted sisterly love. Some bridges don't need to be burned. They need to be vaporized, leaving no trace they ever existed. The legal process was a slow, grinding machinery of dissolution. It was about dividing assets, not lives. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Linda, became my guide and my champion. "We will be fair," she said, "but we will not be generous to foolishness." David, perhaps out of guilt or a desperate desire for a clean break to start his new life, was not overly combative. The house, which was largely paid for by an inheritance from my parents, remained mine. We split the retirement accounts. The division was a mathematical representation of a shared life rendered into fractions. But the real work, the brutal, solitary work, happened inside me. The first phase was pure survival. I ate when I remembered. I slept in fits and starts. I functioned at my job. I'm an architectural designer, on autopilot, grateful for the language of lines and structures that made sense. My friends, the real ones, circled cautiously. They brought food, they listened, they raged on my behalf. Their loyalty was a lifeline. Then came the anger. It arrived not as a firestorm, but as a deep, radioactive core. It was a clean, clarifying anger. It was not about losing David. It was about the theft of my reality, the violation of my friendship, the utter annihilation of my trust. I directed it productively. I hired a personal trainer and pushed my body until it screamed, reclaiming it as my own territory. I took a sabbatical from work and traveled alone to places I'd always wanted to see. The stark cliffs of Iceland, the chaotic markets of Marrakesh. I learned to eat dinner by myself in a restaurant, to enjoy the silence of my own company. I read books they would have hated. I listened to music they would have found odd. The grief came in waves, often at unexpected times. Grief not for him, but for the us I had believed in, for the future I had mapped out, for the friend I had cherished. It was a grief for phantoms. I let it wash over me. I would sit on the floor of my now spare bedroom and weep for the woman who had believed in the story. And then I would get up, wash my face, and keep walking. About a year after the split, I had a revelation. I had been defining myself in opposition to them. I was the wronged wife, the betrayed friend. But that was still giving them centrality in my narrative. I needed a story where they were not the main characters, but a footnote. A catastrophic event, like a hurricane, that reshapes the landscape but does not define it forever. I began to ask myself a new question. Not, who was I without them? But who am I, period? I started small. I painted my bedroom a color David would have called unrestful. I got a dog, a scruffy, joyful rescue mutt he would have deemed too messy. I went back to school for a certificate in sustainable design, a passion I'd shelved for being impractical. I reconnected with an old, pre-David friend who lived across the country. and we discovered a bond that was untainted by the wreckage of my former life. I saw them once about 2 years in. I was at an outdoor farmer's market. They were ahead of me in line at the cheese stall. They looked ordinary. A middle-aged couple doing weekend shopping. He was carrying the bags. She was examining a wheel of goat cheese. There was no electric charge, no cinematic glow. They just looked like two people who had chosen each other, over and above the wreckage they'd created. And I felt nothing. No rage, no pain, no longing. A mild, distant curiosity, as if observing a species I'd once studied but had since moved on from. I turned and walked to the flower stall instead. I bought myself an extravagant bouquet of peonies. My life now is not what I expected. It is quieter, but denser. It is more solitary, but more authentic. The map is no longer settled. It is drawn in real time, with me as the sole cartographer. There are new roads, leading to vistas I couldn't have imagined from the confines of my old, expected life. I have a tenderness for myself that I never possessed before. A respect for my own resilience. I have love in my life. Not romantic, not yet, but deep, abiding love from friends, from my sister, from the community I've consciously built. It is a love that expects nothing, but offers everything. David and Eleanor? They are a closed chapter. I hear through the gossamer thin threads of a small city that they are still together. That they bought a house. I wish them no ill will. Truly. I am indifferent. Their happiness or unhappiness is no longer any currency of mine. They were the earthquake. I am the city that was rebuilt, stronger in the broken places, with better foundations and wider streets. I never expected a thing. And because I expected nothing, I was vulnerable to everything. But in losing everything I thought was mine, I found the only thing that ever truly could be, myself. The woman who survived the seeing. The woman who walked through the fire of betrayal and emerged, not scarred, but tempered. I am not the person I was before that Tuesday. I am more. I am less naive, but more hopeful. Less trusting, but more open. Less certain, but more alive. So if your life feels like a finished book, if your expectations have become a comfortable cage, be careful. The universe has a way of shattering cages. It is terrifying. It is the most painful thing you will ever endure. But on the other side of that shattered glass is a world of unimaginable possibility. You just have to be brave enough to walk through the broken pieces barefoot and start building a new world from the ground up. A world where you expect nothing from anyone, but demand everything from yourself. That is where freedom begins. That is where life, real life, finally starts. Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more story like this, please like the video and subscribe the channel. Hit the bell icon to get notified.